me speak before. When I am brand new to a church, I like to give this little speech before I launch into the topic for the day. So bear with me on the little speech. And the little speech goes something like this. If you're a guest here today and you're checking this church out and you're wondering if this is a place you would like to continue to attend, and you're wondering about these people in this room, and then the speaker gets up to speak, and something I say doesn't resonate well with you today, I'm a guest here too. Come back next week, it'll be better, I promise. All right, fair enough? Can we start with that? And so if there's something, if you're a long-time member, then you're going to come back next week no matter what. But if you're a guest, please give it at least one more try, right? A little bit about me. So my name's Randy Hill. You figured that part out from your bulletin. I'm the assistant to the president. If you've been going to church here for a long time, then you know Chuck Burkeen and Stan Bierman, and I'm taking Stan Bierman's place. And my primary job is to help churches find pastors. And so I try to arrange that, and so that's what I'm going to be meeting with some of your folks tonight about, and I'm excited about that process and enjoying learning to do it, because I've only been at it a couple of months. So you get to have a little grace with me as we go through the process. But I'm looking forward to doing that. Prior to this position, I spent 7 years as the Associate Youth and Pathfinder Director for the conference. And then prior to that, I was the pastor of the Medford Church here in Oregon. I started as their youth pastor, and then the senior pastor retired, and they asked me to step up and take the lead position, and I did that. But pastoring is a second career for me. I was a theology major in college, and then got clear up to my senior year last quarter, and thought, I'm not sure I want to be a pastor, which is always a smart thing to do. And so then I took a number of years to wrestle through that, and so I worked as a locksmith before the Oregon Conference gave me an opportunity to serve. I am married to my wife, Gail. We have 2 sons. One still lives in Medford, and one just got out of the Army and is in the reserves and is waiting on his GI Bill to kick in so that he can begin back in school to move on with his life. So there's a little bit about my wife and I, a little bit about who I am and what I do. I don't know what other questions you need to hear from me other than I think God had a hand in the selection of verses that I have chosen today, because they go very well with the Sabbath school lesson, and I'm excited when God does those kinds of things. And so let's begin with just bowing our heads as we open our Bibles together. Father in heaven, again we pause just now, and we invite your Spirit to be with us as we open the Scripture, your Word, and we ask that you would just open our eyes to the things we should be reminded of and instructed by today. I ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Every once in a while, the genetic makeup of a person just seems to go right. And an amazing athlete is born and produced. When I was in college, I spent a summer working as a youth pastor in Southern California. And on the fringes of the church where I was working, there was this young man who was about 3 years my senior. And over the course of that summer, he and I became friends. He had been one of those guys that was just gifted beyond those of his peers. He was a football player. And by his sophomore year in high school, he had already had college scouts looking his direction. It seemed that nobody could tackle him, and nobody could throw a ball that he couldn't catch. And so he went to a 5A school, one of those really big high schools, and he was put on the varsity squad his freshman year in college. In high school, and he was MVP that year and every year thereafter. And by his senior year, he was looking past college already and looking at the pros and trying to decide which pro team he would be looking to join, be recruited by. Then towards the end of his senior year, they had a home game. And at the end of the home game, a bunch of the guys went out to the center of the field with boxes of fireworks. And they started lighting them off in celebration of the game that they had just won. And that is when tragedy struck. Someone lit M80 or some such firework, and it landed in the box of fireworks, just as he had his head down in that box, looking for his next treasure to light off. The resulting explosion dazed him at first. In fact, it dazed him so much that he didn't recoil like you would have expected him to do. Instead, he still was down in the box when then the second round of explosions, those items that were in the box that had been affected by the first explosion. And the next explosion went off. In the process, his ear was blown off. The side of his head, his chest, and his arm were all burned to the 3rd degree. He was unable to finish that school year, his senior year. He was unable to wow the scouts, unable to recover enough even to qualify for a tryout at one of the community colleges close by. Never mind a Pac-10 team. During his time in the hospital, while the doctors were trying to graft skin back onto his body, he prayed. He prayed for healing. Because being a teenager of simple faith, perhaps even a simplistic faith, he asked God to restore him like he heard in the Bible stories. But that didn't happen. It didn't happen. And the surgeons successfully operated him, and in a sense, he had grafted the skin and formed an ear on the side of his head, sort of, but he was not restored. He was not able to hear as well as he had before. He would never be able to hear a quarterback call an audible in a crowded stadium. And he felt inside that somehow God had let him down. He had prayed for healing, and the healing had not occurred. He really struggled with that. He felt like Jesus should have heard his prayer and acted. Why would God give him talents and then blow them up? Is God some kind of sadistic tyrant that he does these kinds of things? He promises things, but then when you go to claim those things, well, I recently reread a book I hadn't read for a very long time. A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. Maybe you've heard of it. It's been probably 30 years since I had read it. It's a hard book for me to read. If you know that book, if you're familiar with it, you know that C.S. Lewis wrote it after the death of his wife, Joy Davidman. Joy Davidman had at first been an atheist and a communist. And she came to faith in Jesus Christ as a result of Lewis's writings. And then, to be close to the author, she and her 2 teenage sons moved to England, and she served as Lewis's secretary while he taught at Oxford. When Lewis and Davidman were married, there wasn't much romance in it. As I understand it, they were married in a hospital room, and the reason that Lewis married Joy was to assure her that if she died of the cancer she had, he would be responsible for her 2 sons. It was a logical, pragmatic action on his part, not a particularly loving action. But she didn't die. there was remission in the disease, and Joy Davidman came back to health. And C.S. Lewis and Joy Davidman were actually married a second time in the church, and they enjoyed several wonderful years together. And then, as suddenly as the disease had stopped, it started again, and after a period of very painful illness, Joy Davidman died. In order to come to grips with his grief, Lewis wrote his feelings in a series of journals. It was his way of interacting with Jesus. He would journal his thoughts. And those journals became the basis of a Grief Observed, the book that I've read. Maybe you have too. If you know that book, you know that the opening pages are frustrated and harsh. C.S. Lewis had certain expectations about how God would work in his life. And when those expectations were not fulfilled, he became angry and frustrated and confused and somewhat hostile. As Lewis's custom was, he turned from his expectations of God to his experience with God. And at the end of the book, even though the skies are still kind of gray and cloudy, here and there is this shaft of hope that manages to break through those clouds. As I thought of those two experiences, there's a way in which the faith of my friend and this very simple Christian, and C.S. Lewis, this Oxford theological scholar, had at least one thing in common. Both of them had expectations of how God would work in their lives. And when those expectations were not fulfilled, they became confused and hurt, upset, and angry. As I thought about it, it occurred to me that to raise religious expectations too high can be a dangerous and damaging to people. Someone once said that disillusionment is the child of an illusion. Right? If we live with an illusion about how God works in our lives, then we can suffer twice, right? We can suffer the stones and the arrows that life throws at us. And then on top of that, in addition to that, we get this feeling of a heat of a badly wounded faith. It seems that all of us make assumptions about life. We make assumptions about God, about ourselves, about others, and about the way things are, right? And then when life marches to the same tune as our assumptions, we're good, we're happy, we're praising God. But when our assumptions are out of step with our experience, we become confused and angry and disillusioned. Those of us who are Christians move into life's hard experiences with all kinds of assumptions, right? We read Bible promises and we assume that they should apply evenly across the board, right? We read Jeremiah 29:11. We put posters of that up, don't we? And we read that God has plans for us. And then when things don't go like we expect, we think God's plans may have hit the rocks a little, right? Maybe God's not so good at the planning thing as we thought he was. Then we read what Isaiah wrote in chapter 40. That was in our lesson this morning. When he said that the people in exile, he said that to them, these things. They that wait upon the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings as eagles. They will run and not be weary. They will walk and not faint. Our question for today is, how is it that God works? How do we expect him to work? How do you expect him to work in your life? The answer to that simple question divides all kinds of theologies, right? Some people seem to believe that God does everything, right? For them, the world is a stage, and all of the men and women and boys and girls that are on the stage, they're just merely players. They just act according to a script and plans that God has made. And he maps the dialogue even of the conversations. And we simply go through the motions. We are God's puppets. I hear people at the other end of of the spectrum of those theological thoughts, saying, they wonder if God does anything at all. For them, God is the producer of an impromptu play, right? He gets all the characters up on the stage, lined up, he raises the curtain, and then God got on the USS Minnow with Gilligan, and he's taken off on a 3-hour tour. In his absence, the players just kind of muddle through, doing the best they can, and God's going to come back at some time and bring the curtain down. But in between God raising the curtain and the curtain coming down, it's really up to us, they say. So the question is then, how is it that God does work? How does God break into human affairs? I'm not sure there's one way that he does it. I think maybe there are several ways in which God works with us. One way in which God works with us, we might call the intervention of God. The intervention. What God does is he reaches down into a difficult situation and he takes us out of that situation, or he reaches down and takes the situation away. And that's what we usually mean when we talk about a miracle, right? That's the intervention of God with his people. And if I'm thinking of biblical examples of that, immediately Exodus 14 comes to mind. In that passage, the Israelites have left Egypt, right? And they are confronted by this huge body of water and mountains that are beside them, and they're being pursued by the Egyptian army. And they are squeezed between Pharaoh and the deep Red Sea, right? And in that moment, in Exodus 14, verse 13, the people cry out to God in their terror and their agony, in their, if I may say it, in their worry. I had to say that for you. Cry out in their worry. And Moses stands before them and he says, "Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring to you today." And in that moment, the sea opens and the people walk across as though they're on dry land. And when Pharaoh and his army try to follow, the waters tumble in and the armies are destroyed. It was the miraculous intervention of God on behalf of his people. It was a miracle. I love miracle stories. One of my favorites is found in 2 Kings chapter 6. I can't help but put me in this story. I can't help but imagine what it was like. Elisha's city is surrounded by an army, and his servant begins to worry, and he says to his servant, "God, open his eyes so that he can see." And then Elisha goes outside, and he's heading over to the army, and while he's heading over, he says, "God, strike them blind." And all of a sudden, the army is blind, and Elisha goes up to the leader of the army. Can you imagine doing this? And he says, "Where are you headed? What are you looking for?" "We're looking for Elisha. We're looking for this city." "Oh, I'm sorry, you're on the wrong road. This isn't the right city. Here, follow me. Let me be helpful." And Elisha leads this army. And I think about those Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of guys, right? They're wearing their armor. They have their swords and their spears and their shields, and they clank when they walk, and they're walking along, and he's leading them. And it's like watching a kindergarten class on the road, because they're now having, do you carry your sword and your spear? No, you can't, because you have to join hands with the person behind you and the person in front of you. Otherwise, because you're blind. So you have to walk hand in hand, or maybe they got a rope, and all of them had to hold on to the rope. Have you seen a kindergarten class do this when they're walking? I can imagine this giant army of all of these men now being led by Elisha to the city of Samaria. And as he approaches, they open the gates of Samaria and they take the whole army into the city. And then their eyes are opened when the whole army of Samaria has now surrounded them. I just giggle at what happens next, because the army in Samaria says, what do they say? They say, "Let us kill them. Boy, here's our chance." He said, No. They've had a rough night. Let's feed them breakfast. And all of a sudden, the whole city of Samaria is making omelets and cinnamon rolls and cutting up fruit, and they're spreading a table before their enemies. Can you imagine the miraculous working of God, the intervention of God in that scenario? Just blows my mind. I love miracle stories. You want to see one from the New Testament? Here you find one in Luke chapter 18. Jesus comes to the village of Jericho, and there he finds this guy who's been born blind. And when the blind man hears that Jesus has hit town, he screams at the top of his lungs over and over and over again, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And he says it enough times that he gets Jesus' attention. Jesus hears the cry, and the man is brought to him, and he says, "What do you want me to do for you?" And he says, "Lord, I just want to see." Okay, receive your sight. Your faith has healed you. And in that moment, God intervenes in this man's life and heals him. He was able to see. No making mud and putting it in his eyes. No sending him to an ophthalmologist to see if there's something can be done, remove the cataract. Simply a spoken word, and the man could see. The direct intervention of God. When we think about how God works in our lives, the first thing that comes to our mind is that maybe God will perform a miracle in this situation. I don't know why we think that way. Maybe it goes back to our infancy. When we were babies, if we were hungry, we made the appropriate noises, and all of a sudden the big people came and put a bottle of food in our mouths. It was a miracle in our life. Maybe our diapers were soiled, and we made the appropriate cries, and there was deliverance from discomfort. If you've been to church all your life, you know those are the stories that we like to tell. We love those stories. Maybe we church people are always trying to make God look good, because those are the stories we tell most frequently. All the way through Sabbath school and church, we hear about the marvelous miracles of God on our behalf, on God's behalf for his people. You figure if he did it for them, why not do it for us? Don't get me wrong. I don't think it's wrong to expect a miracle. In fact, I imagine that we could go around this room today, and some, if not all of you, could tell about a time in your life where you experienced the intervention of God. Often, I have discovered it involves driving a car, where we go, wow, that just shouldn't have happened that way, but God must have had his hand. My guardian angel must have done something. It's not wrong of us to expect a miracle. The danger is for us to believe that that is the only way that God works. That is the major way that God works, because disillusionment is the child of an illusion. If you live with that kind of an illusion, you'll find that you'll still go through life's pain, but with a damaged faith. There are other ways in which God works with his people, right? Not only is there the intervention of God, but there's what we might call the interaction of God, right? In this situation, God reaches down and empowers us to make a difference in our situations. The interaction of God through his people. Stories like Samson and Gideon and David in the Old Testament come to mind. The preaching of Paul in the New Testament. If we think back to Exodus, right? Exodus chapter 3, God says, "Moses, you go, and I'll go with you," right? And if you follow that incident, and you discover that's what's happened. God worked, and Moses worked, and the people of Israel worked, and they became workers together with God. The interaction of God with people. It seems to me that there are times, many times, when God, for some reason beyond us, just wouldn't perform a miracle for us. I hear people that get miracles almost every day. A couple before breakfast, a few before lunch, one in the afternoon, one in the evening. Their stories go like this. I was at Costco the other day, and I was looking for a parking space, and I found one. And again, maybe at Costco that is a miracle. But everything for them is miraculous for them. When I hear these folks, it seems to me that they're not just God's children. They're often God's spoiled brats. But I think there are some things in a community, in a nation, in a world that will not be changed unless God works and unless we work. Unless we become workers together with God. Did you ever look at that great commission we find in Matthew? And there's this great charge that Jesus gives his disciples. It is sandwiched between two great affirmations about himself. First, there's the affirmation of his power. All authority, he says, in heaven and on earth. I'm thinking that's all authority. Has been given to me. And at the end of the Great Commission, surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. He states his omnipotence and he states his omnipresence. But between those two statements is this charge. Go and make disciples of all nations. I think that no woman, no man has ever come to God unless first he or she is led by the Holy Spirit. But I also believe with all of my heart that no man, no woman, no boy or girl will ever stand in God's presence who does not have a human thumbprint on them, a friend who cared enough to share about God. The world will not be evangelized. Oregon will not be evangelized unless there is a working of God. Oregon also will not be evangelized unless we work. Unless there is a working together with God, unless we develop a friendly posture towards those we seek to convert. The interaction of God with his people, it's never equal. Have you noticed that? God saying, okay, here's how it works. I'll match you effort for effort. I don't see anywhere where he does that. No, it's more like the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, isn't it? You give your all, and then God makes up the difference. There's a third way which God works. Not only the intervention and the interaction of God, but the third way we might call the inner action of God. God doesn't always perform a miracle, and it seems sometimes God doesn't even allow us the strength to get out of a situation. God leaves us pretty much who and where we are. But he does something beautiful in our lives. And the inner action of God with his people. If I was thinking of a biblical example of that, I would immediately think of 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where Paul writes about his thorn in the flesh. We don't know what the thorn was. It may have been malaria, it might have been bad eyesight. We don't know what it was, but we do know it was something that dogged the apostle, right? And he says in 2 Corinthians 12, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. God didn't perform a miracle and remove whatever this was from the apostle Paul. God didn't allow Paul to reach in and somehow pull out this thorn in his skin or in his soul. He left Paul where he was and he did something beautiful in his life. I admire those stories of God's interaction as well. A generation ago, we were inspired by this lady by the name of Corrie ten Boom. Remember that story? Wow, her stories of God's inner action in her life while she was in the concentration camp. Those are amazing stories. My generation had Johnny Erickson Tada, the quadriplegic. And then the generation behind mine has watched this young man, but now he's a middle-aged man, I guess, Nick Vujicic. You know that name? Here's this young man who has been used by God, but he's never had arms or legs. He just has the trunk of his body and his head. And in Nick, we see this display of God's power and grace. God didn't choose to intervene in his life and allow a miracle when all of a sudden he had legs and arms. He didn't allow Nick to have some type of power within himself to all of a sudden grow arms or legs. And modern science has yet to find a way to change his circumstance. God has left Nick exactly where he is. Exactly. But he's done something amazingly beautiful in his life. The inner action of God with his people. The interaction of God. Probably more than other ways that God works. Those workings, they urge me forward when I hear the stories of transformation in people's lives. When I stop to think about it, I think I like those stories as much or more than the miracle stories that I hear. When somebody says, I used to be like this, and God changed me. Those are holy moments when you hear those stories. Now, a few minutes ago, I quoted you the words of Isaiah that we had in Sabbath School, chapter 40. It's where God says, those that hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. Some people believe that Isaiah got this wrong. He destroyed the poetic structure of these verses. Isaiah talks about flying and then running and then walking. You would think he would have done it the other way around. Don't you walk before you run? Wouldn't you run before you would fly? But maybe Isaiah got it exactly right. They that wait on the Lord will renew their strength. And sometimes, because of God's intervention, they will mount up with wings as eagles. They will be carried above the circumstances, and they will be able to dance among the clouds. At other times, it will be the interaction of God, and they will be able to run with him and not be weary. And at other times, God does something inside, and the miracle will be that they can walk and not faint. Sometimes life is hard. There are days when we talk with our friends and they're just overwhelmed by what's happening. There are times when they wake up in the morning and they wonder if they can make it through the day. They wake up in the morning and they wonder if they can make it till noon. And at noon they wonder if they can make it till evening. Maybe that's you today. You don't expect to fly. You don't expect to run. You're wondering, can I make it till noon? Can I just walk? And in the evening, when they head to bed, they go, or you go, I go some days. Thank God I made it through today. I made it through this day. God keeps his promises according to his purposes and according to our needs. Sometimes we mount up with eagles and we soar among the clouds and can almost touch the stars with a great event that has happened in our life. Other times, we run and we're not weary. We are given the second wind of grace. And at other times, we walk one step at a time. And we come to the end of our day marveling that we made it that long. We didn't faint away. Have I not commanded you? God says to Joshua. Be strong and courageous. Don't be frightened. Don't be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. God will not lie to you. They who wait upon the Lord will renew their strength. Sometimes they mount up with wings as eagles. Other times we run and we're not weary. And at other times, we walk.
still my own. Though his hand may lead me over dreary ways, anywhere with Jesus is a house of praise. Anywhere, dear, I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere with Jesus I can go to sleep. When the gloomy shadows round about me creep, knowing I shall wake and never more to roam. Anywhere with Jesus will be home, sweet home. Anywhere, dear, I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go.
Father in heaven, thank you so much for these comforting words that you have left for us to find and mine. As we go through our week this week, Lord, I pray you would open our eyes to the ways you are working with us. I ask a blessing on each one as we leave today. In Jesus' name, amen.